Welcome back to the Teacher's AI Cafe. I'm Kane, a teacher and a parent who wants AI to give us back our time. I share practical classroom-tested AI strategies to cut down your workload, improve your feedback and reduce stress so you can get your evenings back and be more present with your friends and family. No jargon, just actionable steps. Grab your mug. Now let's get going. A few years ago, we were debating whether to have smartphones in the classroom. Actually, the debate is still ongoing. And as a general rule, the move, at least in the Western world, and you hear reporters, smartphones are no longer allowed in the classroom. In many ways, that's good, though in my district or my area, we can use them in the classroom under teacher direction. I think that's a really good compromise because a lot of people think that basically the smartphone is the computer for a lot of this generation coming through. Whereas the old days we had desktop computers and laptops, that was our way of communicating with each other. But today I want to talk about something a little bit bigger. Basically, across the world, schools are experimenting with artificial intelligence. Some are reporting dramatic reductions in teacher workload and exciting examples of student learning. Others have spent millions of dollars only to abandon projects a few months later. So the interesting question is not whether AI works, because it does work. I guess the interesting question is why it works in some schools and fails in others. So the past few months, I've been starting to look at different case studies. I'm trying to get them through and trying to look at some educational implementations of AI that are currently taking place. What I found was not really a story about technology, which I think is the basis of why they probably were successful. It's really a story about leadership, teaching, and how schools manage change. And I think this is important, that at the core of it is that teacher expertise and the experience of experienced teachers' leadership to how we actually implement it. And I think that some of the speakers, people I've had on interviewing, they keep highlighting that how they're actually taking control of that. So I'm going to focus on a platform today which I've pretty much ignored, which is Copilot. I did mention I'm going to start looking at that, do some comparisons, but I'm going to look at a couple of examples of where Copilot was successfully implemented into schools and what the benefits was. So the first one we're going to look at is actually from Microsoft's website itself. Obviously very biased. Everything's rosy. Everything went perfectly. But like I said, it's a good starting point. They're promoting it. You can actually go out and see this implementation. So let's start in England. Discovery Trust, starting with people, not technology. So Discovery Trust oversees 20 schools across England's East Midlands. Schools include things like primary schools, special education settings, secondary schools. Like many schools, they are faced with the challenge that every teacher listening understands staff is drowning in admin work. Story of our life, and apparently why a lot of people are quitting teaching and not getting into it. So reports, lessons, writing, feedback, emails kept arriving, all the usual sort of things that pile through our inboxes and on our desks or appear in meetings to us. So teachers are finding that more and more of their time was spent consumed by tasks that sat around teaching rather than the actual teaching. And there's some really good memes online about that at the moment, which is quite funny. When Discovery Trust decided to explore AI, they avoided, according to Microsoft, they avoid the mistake that many organisations make. They did not by simply giving every teacher access to AI and hoping for the best. And this sort of comes out the core of change implementation. Every time we do change, we actually need to develop and train our staff and get structures and processes in place to actually support our staff, instead of just throwing them through to the walls. Instead, they spent the first year focusing on almost entirely on their leaders and their key staff. The reason was simple. Before asking teachers to use the AI effectively, leaders needed to understand both its possibilities and its limitations. Staff received training, workflows were analysed, and usage was monitored, and questions were asked and concerns were discussed and addressed. Only after building that foundation did the trust, as in the organisation, begin expanding access to the tool. And the results were significant. So this is important change management because your organisation is only as good as your staff. So if you've got good leadership and they train your staff, you're going to have a good organisation because you put the time and effort into it. So what actually happened? So they used 59 pilot licenses of Copilot. Discovery Trust reported that 100% adoption among the pilot users estimated that staff reclaimed about 4,500 hours of work annually. Obviously, if we're looking at 59, divided by 59, that's how much we're saving each as a rough estimate. But that is a significant amount of savings across their workforce for the year. One teacher described Copilot as being, it's like having another experienced teacher sitting on your shoulder. I like to call them your virtual assistant. That image stayed with me, I guess, because it is something important. The successful schools are not using AI to replace teachers. They're using it to amplify the teachers and what they do and make them more efficient. An example from the case study was from Year 6 history. You focused on World War II. Students listened to wartime soundscapes and generated descriptive vocabulary. Traditionally, creating a differentiated writing supports from that activity would have required substantial teacher prep time. Instead, Copilot transformed the students' own vocabulary into differentiated sentences, starters, and scaffolds. So the students still generated the ideas, the teacher still guided the learning, and the technology simply helped bridge the gap more efficiently, and that distinction sort of matters. So AI was supporting the learning process. And that in itself is not unusual going through that. But what they actually did as part of the process, if you delve a bit deeper into the project, simply they actually the teachers modeled using AI. So the teachers at front stepped students through how they wanted to use it, the benefits, what the limitations were, and actually provide some structure and direction to the students as well as they'd been told in their own training. And that change differential of actually giving the skills and the expectations as well as the limits or guardrails of how you want them to use it, and it resulted in a very effective use of the AI in the implementation in terms of Copilot. And that is an example of good change management. So the second one we looked at in detail is the Brisbane Catholic Education system, where, once again, the case study we're looking at obviously benefits staff, but also for students. So this one comes, Brisbane, if you don't know where it is, this is Brisbane, Australia, up on just north of the Gold Coast in Queensland. So they cater for about 140 schools, employs approximately 12,500 educators, support staff. And when they began experimenting with Copilot, they were just not looking for classroom novelty. They were looking for ways to improve both staff workload and student learning. The headline statistics attracted attention immediately. Teachers were saving on average 9.3 hours per week, which is a lot. And that's basically one less working day per week that they're actually applying outside work to actually get this done. So imagine what teachers could be doing with this extra day a week. Honestly, hopefully they're just relaxing with their family. But like I said, we don't know the context of here. What interested more is what happened with the students. Rather than encouraging students to use AI, simply generate their answers. School focused on helping students ask better questions. So students use the Copilots to brainstorm inquiry questions. So they'll give you a task and go through, and they would get an overarching question, and then there would be a subset of questions. We do this, I know, in HAS and a lot of different areas, is you'll then break down into smaller questions to help answer the larger question. They used it to help unpack this, things like curriculum standards, design learning pathways for the students to meet those curriculum standards, and they refine their project ideas. One school reports students created their own big questions for investigation rather than simply responding to teachers' generated tasks. And this is important because I find with my students is we really want to teach them to be problem finders, to find gaps or information that's missing and then pursue those. Because people who go find problems also come up with solutions because they can look at the world in different ways and they ask questions and wonder and build their curiosity of why do we do it this way? We could be doing it that way. And I find my students really do struggle when I give them a history question and they've got to come up with 4 minor questions. They're all often very basic. So allowing AI to do that sort of bridges that cognitive ability of students and develop those skills in actually doing that. So I think that's an important part and a good area of project. Another example that involved was one with dyslexia, using Copilot to make learning materials more accessible. And obviously Microsoft have already got tools in there where they can read aloud for people who aren't aware of that, Microsoft tools. Another example involved a student. I've already covered that one. What emerges from the examples is a different picture of AI, one that's presented in the headlines of all cheating and students using to complete all their work. Conversation is frequently framed where the students are using the AI to write their essays, not actually doing the critical thinking. The Brisbane example suggests a different possibility that I guess AI helps students become more active participants in their own learning. And basically it could help them plan, question, investigate, and reflect more effectively by actually prompting and giving questions. The questions we normally do as teachers, but they can do it themselves and get that more personalised learning and more effectively getting those prompts back to them without having to wait for your actual teacher. That doesn't mean there obviously weren't challenges with that. The Brisbane Catholic Education repeatedly emphasised the importance of training, governance and ethical use and clear expectations of the teachers, similar to what happened in the UK example. Students were expected to question all AI outputs, and they actually ran through training and modelling of how to do that. When we get an output, how do you go through? How do you verify it's correct? How do you use your existing subject and context knowledge to actually make sure you're getting the correct answer and feedback back, and how you actually question it and need to go do further research depending on what the response is. So the idea is they're not accepting these things uncritically. And as I said the other day, we had just had that digital literacy report here in Australia, and it was very poor. It's majorly declined. So the focus in the school system was actually creating student agency around the use of AI to improve their individual studies more than a dependency. Now, these are two very brief examples where things have gone right, both using Microsoft Copilot. What happens when things go wrong? So what we're going to talk about here is the Los Angeles story. So in 2024, Los Angeles Unified School District launched an AI chatbot called Ed. The vision was ambitious. The chatbot would support hundreds of thousands of students and families, provide personalised assistance, support multiple languages, help students navigate their learning. Sounds bang on. Exactly what we want for our bots on our computers. On paper, it sounds revolutionary. It sounds like a really good solution. I don't know about revolutionary because this idea can be done in other forms. In reality, the project collapsed within months. So the company behind the chatbot ran into serious financial difficulties because when you rely on a commercial entity, they've got to make money. And obviously the funding that was coming for this or their estimation of the cost was far more than what they were getting in terms of what they actually quoted for it. It's not unusual because you think about it with government, they'll often take the lowest quote. It depends on how well the brief has been written, whether they have enough protection and support within the system and infrastructure to actually employ it at such a low cost. Anyway, that's governance. And the questions emerged around governance oversight. Teacher received limited training. And students struggle to see meaningful value. So we'll see two problems in this case study compared to the first two. One, there's no training for the staff. You just can't roll technology out of any description, say, here you go away and learn it. There was no training how to use it. There was no obviously direction from leadership. Someone obviously high up in the department said, yeah, this is a fantastic idea. They created a little project team and implemented it and rolled it out and said, go for your life. And the students, once again, didn't see the value of it because they weren't taught how to use it. So for example, as a plugin, if you use Chrome, you've got Brisk. It's always sitting there, but unless you're trying to use it, you're not really going to use it. And what the funny thing was that came out of the chatbot was the criticisms from the chatbot was often the chatbot redirected the students back to their teachers. And there's nothing wrong with that. And David, who I chatted to from Boston, said that's probably a fantastic thing for the chatbot doing. But if you're giving it a question, and you're introducing and saying, ask your teacher, it's not good. You spent multi-millions of dollars on this AI initiative, and the default answer is ask your teacher. It's not really a good investment in time and effort and infrastructure, and also wasting the teacher and the student's time. And this reminds me, if people, the old ones, the old Clippy that used to be in Microsoft would pop up and torment people and not really help you. They killed it. It was a little paper clip that appeared called Clippy, and there's enough memes out there. I think the close. I watched Loki, and they had that star thing that reminded me so much of Clippy. They had that thing that used to float around and annoy people. But the idea of Clippy was good in Microsoft. It's clip on and get all the support and everything, but it didn't work. It was really poor. So this is AI version of Clippy. So I guess it wasn't being another equivalent. Say buying yourself a self-driving car, then asking you to take over it every time you came to an intersection because it doesn't know what to do. So the failure is not really about the technology itself. The issue is the implementation. Putting aside the lack of good answers is really implementation. When you want people to take on any technology, it's got to be implemented correctly with the right training support, and that is got to be ongoing training. It's just a once-off seminar, as we often do at education. It's got to repeat it again and again. So looking back at this case study, the teacher preparation was really limited. Success appeared to be measured through adoption rather than learning outcomes. And technology arrived before an educational framework or pedagogy was actually in place to actually implement it successfully. Doing it that way never really ends well. So what do successful schools do differently? When you compare success stories with failures, several patterns become obvious. First, successful schools start with leadership rather than technology. Second, they heavily invest in the professional learning, so they're solving a problem within it. So if you see a problem, you've got to develop training to actually help people overcome that problem or that obstacle. Third, they view AI as a tool, which it is just a tool, for supporting teacher judgment rather than replacing it. And it's very key to where we're going at the moment. And fourth, they focus on student thinking rather than student productivity. But perhaps most importantly, they treat implementation as a long-term process rather than a quick technology fix. Discovery Trust rolled this out over years as a 3-year program. Brisbane Catholic Education invested extensively in training and governance before they implemented it. Neither organisation simply handed out licences, everything would work okay. Schools that struggled often did exactly that. So what does this mean for teachers? Well, after going through these case studies, it really comes back to the same thing, really good change management. So the future of successful AI is not itself, it's really about which platform it is and what the actual individual technology is, because they're all very similar. It's not going to be decided, you're a ChatGPT, you're a Claude, you're a Copilot. The future will be determined by the pedagogy we develop to use these tools. Successful will use AI to actually help the teachers actually teach. They'll be used to help the students think and reflect. They'll be used to support inquiry, reflection, and differentiation. Unsuccessful examples often focus on the technology itself. As a history teacher, we spend a great deal of our time helping students evaluate sources. What perhaps we should do in the project, AI is in exactly the same way. Simply, it's not something just to trust. It's not something to fear. It's something to interrogate, question, evaluate, and use thoughtfully within our education systems. There seems to be less emerging from schools about getting this right. AI is not replacing good teaching. It's about making good teaching even more important and using AI to do more than we could do before. On a side note, before we wrap it up today, I went to a big international conference that's around defence industries, part of my role here, and we was listening to one of the companies there, and they're saying we've got to, obviously in their trades, they've got a workforce shortage, and what they've introduced or they're trying to implement, which is a technology to solve that, they call them Cobots. They're basically robots which are now assisting the tradesmen, and they're really emphasising that these robots, which are obviously driven by machine learning and AI to know how to do tasks, is there to support their existing workers and future workers. It's not there to replace them. And they're really trying to emphasise that point, that human judgment and knowledge outside education, when using this technology, is critically important when they're building the big projects, which are very highly technical. So as I said, we're seeing AI coming in many different forms. In education, we need to critique it, but we need schools to implement it properly. And it can't be done overnight. It's going to be done slowly and consistently with training. But at the same time, it needs to be a system-wide approach across multiple schools, because I know for myself and others, it's really hodgepodge, different teachers interested in taking the lead and teaching different things to their staff. Based on needs, well, like I said, there's no real one coherent plan at this point. Until then, look after yourself, keep experimenting with AI. Let me know how you're using it in the classroom. That would be fantastic. And I'll talk to you soon.